الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا اللهم بما علمتنا وزدنا اللهم علما وعملا إنك ولي ذلك والقادر عليه. أما بعد، فهذا درسنا في كتاب الحافظ ابن حجر رحمه الله بلوغ المرام، ووصلنا في كتاب الطهارة إلى باب الحيض، وهذا إن شاء الله آخر باب في هذا الكتاب إن شاء الله. ونسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يوفقنا لكل ما يحب ويرضى وأن يعلمنا ما ينفعنا. So we are reached now the last chapter in the book of Purification, and this is the chapter of Hayd, or Menses. And this is a chapter which has a lot of details with it, and it's important for our sisters, to know these matters, and for us as husbands and fathers to be aware, so we can guide them if there's some confusion, or to ask for them if there's some question from the people of knowledge. And so this chapter, I'm just going to check, make sure this is connected. أولا، الحيض بمعنى سالة، حاضة بمعنى سالة، وفي الاصطلاح الحيض سيلان الدم الطبيعي الذي يرخيه الرحم عند البلوغ. So what is menses? It is the natural bleeding, the natural blood which a woman has, and it is that begins at the time of her maturity. When she becomes a mature woman, then the menses start in general. And in fact, it is one of the signs of maturity for the women, is that they begin their menses. And هو يعني دم معتاد، والغالب أنه يأتي كل شهر، والغالب أن أيامه ستة أو سبعة. And we know the menses comes every month, usually. And it lasts for 6 to 7 days, usually. This is the common condition, but it can vary. Some women can have menses for 10 days, some for 3 days, more or less. And sometimes it can come, for a longer period of time. Or for example, a woman can, for some reason, miss her menses for 3-4 months. قد يغيب عنها الحيض لشهور، لشهرين أو 3 أو 4، ثم إذا رجع بشدة، وقد تحيض شهرا كاملا، لأنها قد اجتمع فيها الدم لهذه المدة، فيخرج وينزل لشهر كامل. For example, a woman can miss her menses for 3-4 months, and then when it comes a lot, as if the blood maybe had accumulated, and maybe she bleeds more than her usual 6-7 days, but rather a month or more. And how would we know whether it's bleeding of menses or bleeding of sickness? Because there's also what's called dam istihada, dam hayd wa dam istihada. Dam istihada, dam marad, dam غير طبيعي. What is istihada? Because there's istihada is bleeding which is not the natural period bleeding. This is the bleeding that comes for some sickness, for some reason, not the monthly bleeding. هو إما لمرض أو ورم أو التهاب أو لإرق انفصلت وانقطعت ونحو ذلك من أمراض الرحم. واستحاضة سيلان الدم في غير أوقاته المعتادة أو زيادة في نزول الدم إما كمية أو زمنيا. And what is istihada? Istihada, as we said, is coming out of the ordinary bleeding because of sickness, because of a blood vessel that may have ruptured. So it becomes like a bleeding, like a person has a cut. A woman can have a blood vessel rupture down there, and therefore she has bleeding, which is out of the norm, out of the time, which is the menses time. And usually it's a longer time period of bleeding than the usual. Or it could be بسبب استخدام أدوية أو حبوب التي تأخذها المرأة فهذا أيضا من الأسباب. Also from the reasons for it is, of course, a woman takes some medicine, and that medicine disrupts her bleeding in a way that she has an unnatural bleeding. It's not hayd. ومن أسبابه أيضا حالات نفسية من اضطراب أو قلق أو خوف أو نحو ذلك. Also from the causes of the abnormal bleeding is some psychological problem, stress or anxiety, something affecting a woman psychologically that can cause the bleeding to come unnaturally. And this is well known amongst the doctors. So that is what istihada. And that's important because الاستحاضة لا تمنع من صلاة ولا صيام. إنما الحيض المرأة لا يصوم وهي حائض ولا تصوم ولا تصلي. محرم عليها. It's important to differentiate because the menstrual bleeding, the woman is prohibited to pray and fast. She's not allowed, it's haram. But the istihada bleeding, the false bleeding, she has to pray and fast in it because it's just like a cut. When a person has a cut on his skin, he still prays, he still fasts. Likewise, the woman in the istihada. So this is very important to distinguish between them. And there are ways to distinguish. Not only the time period, a woman if has a regular period, she is mu'tada. She is a woman who has a regular period. From the first time she became mature, she bled, for example, she bled the first 6 days of every month. Now, all of a sudden, she's bleeding for 2 weeks. She has an idea that the first 6 days of the month is her period, because this is what is her usual case. So she builds upon that. That's one way to differentiate. That she goes by her ad, her usual period. Another differentiation between the false and fake bleeding, false and true bleeding, is the nature of the blood. Tamyiz, that's called a tamyiz, to differentiate between. And that is in 4 matters: the color of the blood, the thickness, the smell, and its clotting, how rapidly it clots. So the first, the color. دم الحيض أسود، يعني أحمر يميل إلى السواد، ودم الاستحاضة أحمر خفيف. So what the first color, دم الحيض, the menstrual, is dark, almost black in color, whereas the istihada, the false bleeding, is red, just like a cut. The cut bleeding comes out red, not blackish. So that's one, the color. Number 2, we said the thickness. دم الحيض غليظ ثخين ودم استحاضة رقيق. The thickness of the menstrual bleeding is very thick, and the false bleeding is thin, just like a cut, thin bleeding. والفصل الثالث في الرائحة. دم الحيض له رائحة كريهة منتنة ودم الاستحاضة ليس له كذا، ليس له ذلك. The third matter is the smell. The smell of the menses is a bad smell. It's a putrid, bad smell coming. What istihada is doesn't have any smell, just like a cut. It doesn't really have smell. Okay. The fourth matter is the clotting. دم حيض لا يتجمد إلا ببطء ودم استحاضة يتجمد سريعا. So the fourth matter is the clotting. The menstrual bleeding does not clot very quickly. It's slow to clot. Although it's thick, it comes thick, but doesn't come clotted very quickly. Whereas the false bleeding of the vein or the sickness, it clots quickly, just like if we have a cut. Okay, so basically, you think of the dam istihada, the false bleeding, for which a woman still has to pray, still has to fast, and do everything usual. That is like the blood vessel that is cut on a person's arm. It's it's reddish, not dark black. It is thin. It has no smell, and it clots quickly. Okay, those are the four matters. And a woman can pay attention. Usually, she'll find these qualities to differentiate them. The period, no. And why do we say the period does not clot quickly? That's the type of blood it is. It actually was clotted in the rahim, in the uterus, and then it kind of came down and flowed and kind of dissolved the clot. So therefore, it doesn't clot again, except slowly. Okay, it's a different kind of blood altogether. It's the uterus blood of the woman, as opposed to the cut that she may have down there or some other sickness bleeding. That will be clotting very quickly. So that's tamyiz. So we have two matters, and usually في الغالب يتفق العادة مع التمييز. يعني الدم للمرأة عند عادتها عادة حيضها له هذه الصفات فهي تميزها ويتفق العادة مع التمييز. Usually the period the woman has, the bleeding, the first 6 days of every month, it has these attributes. Okay, and she can distinguish these things. Okay, even if she has some unnatural false bleeding, it's still it's gonna come outside of her usual pattern, and with characteristics, as we mentioned, of like a vein bleeding. Okay, there may be some cases though when a woman, when she has the istihada, عند الاستحاضة ينتقل العادة ينتقل الحيض إلى وقت آخر في الشهر. وهذا يعني وارد أن المرأة إذا أتاها المرض يتغير عادتها، فقد يأتيها التمييز في وسط الشهر في وقت المرض، ولكن قبل المرض كان التمييز في أول الشهر، فكان دم حيض بصفاته في أول الشهر، ثم عند المرض واستحاضة في أول الشهر يأتيها دم استحاضة، دم رقيق يعني أحمر رقيق غير منتن، وفي وسط الشهر يأتيها التمييز، وهنا انتقل الحيض إلى وقت آخر. فحين ذاك هي قيل عند الشافعية أنها تقدم وتغلب التمييز، لأن هذا هو الأصل، أن إذا هي مميزة هي تغلب التمييز، فانتقل عادتها من أول الشهر إلى منتصف الشهر، وهذا وارد. So for example, usually we said they come together, okay? But there are some cases, with meaning the period timing, even in sickness, it remains the same. And she has the attributes in the time of the regular period timing, say the first week of the month. But it could happen that when she becomes sick, the period moves, okay? It moves in the month. It could move to the middle of the month, okay? So then she can't just rely on the first 6 days anymore, okay? So how would she know? Here, she should look at the attributes of the blood, and amongst the scholars of Shafi'iyya, they say this is the more, what she gives priority to is the attributes of the blood. If she finds before she was sick, okay, her period came in the first of the month, first 6 days, okay, and it had all those attributes: dark, smelly, thick, so on. Then, when she had sickness and she had extra bleeding, she finds that these attributes are now in the middle of the month, in the 15th, and for the next week, 15th to the 21st, she has the dark, smelly, thick blood. But it's not like her usual time anymore. So what should she do in this month? She should give preference to the blood that has the attributes. Okay, the attributes as it comes in the hadith. This is based upon hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna dam al-hayd." هذا أول حديث في الباب, the first hadith in the chapter. He said, "Inna dam al-hayd dam aswad yu'rif or yu'raf." That the bleeding of the hayd is black and it has smell. Yu'rif means it has arf, smell. So it's now in the middle of the month. So she bases her period to be the middle of the month. Now it's changed, and it can happen when a woman gets sick. Her period can shift from the middle of the month to the middle, from the beginning of the month to the end of the month, or vice versa, or any such variation. So this is not usual, but a woman should know it can happen. And if she can distinguish the quality of the blood, she prioritizes that has the qualities, and says that is my menses. And now in the beginning of the month is istihala, it's the false bleeding because it has light color, it's thin, and so on, has no smell. So this is now I pray and fast now at that time, and when the blood changes, I stop praying and fasting. So that's just some basic rules, guidelines to this matter. That's when we'll read the first hadith regarding this chapter. Hadith 32 بعد المئة عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن فاطمة بنت أبي حبيش كانت تستحاض فقال لها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن دم الحيض دم أسود يعرف ويعرف فإذا كان ذلك فأمسكي عن الصلاة فإذا كان الآخر فتوضئي وصلي. رواه أبو داود والنسائي. Hadith Sahih. This hadith was mentioned before in the chapter of the nawaqid al-wudu, the things that break one's wudu. Because dam istihada, this hadith was from Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh radiyallahu anha. She said, it was reported from her, Aisha reported radiyallahu anha, that she used to have the false bleeding, the istihada. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to her, this is not the Menses blood. No, the Menses blood is black and it has smell, it has characteristics we know. And so when it is the menstrual blood, then do not pray. That's your period. And when it is the false blood, istihala, then make wudu and pray. Meaning make wudu for every prayer. Make wudu for every prayer. Although she's bleeding, okay? But it's okay, this is not the menstrual blood. Okay, this is false bleeding. So she has to, it breaks the wudu because it's coming from her private area. So she has to redo the wudu for every prayer. But she still prays. Whereas the menses, as we know, she's not allowed to pray. So the menstrual period, she finishes those 6, 7 or so on days. She takes a bath. Once the blood has changed or the period time is over, she takes a bath, and now she's in the istihada period, making wudu for every prayer. Okay, if possible, and that's one way. Make wudu for every prayer. So this hadith we mentioned, yes, in the chapter earlier, the things that break one's wudu, and it had other wording in that chapter. We'll mention that wording. جاء في الحديث الرابع بعد 60 عن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت جاءت فاطمة بنت أبي حبيش إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقالت يا رسول الله إني امرأة أستحاض فلا أطهر فأدعو الصلاة قال لا إنما ذلك إرق وليس بحيض. So this additional wording, she was asked in another wording of this hadith, he told her, no, that is only like a blood vessel. Istihada, like you mentioned. Blood vessel bleeding is what? Red, thin, no smell, clots quickly. So don't. So yeah. So do not leave your prayer. Do not leave your prayer in the false bleeding. Okay. So he said, فَإِذَا أَقْبَلَتْ حَيْضَتُكِ فَدَعِي الصَّلَاةِ. So when the menstrual period comes with the characteristics, then leave the prayer. وَإِذَا أَدْبَرَتْ فَاغْتَسِلِي فَأَغْسِلِي عَنْكِ الدَّمَ ثُمَّ صَلِّي. So when the period leaves, then take a bath. Because we have to, woman has to, at the end of her menses, take a bath. As Allah said, فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَ فَأْتُوهُنَّ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ. Allah said, يسألونك عن الحيض قل هو أذى. يسألونك عن الحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض حتى يطهرن فإذا تطهرن فأتوهن. Allah said that do not approach the women when they have menses. And they will come in the rules of the menses. Of course, a man is not allowed to approach his wife in her private area and until she is pure, until the bleeding stops. And then when she takes a bath, then after that, then she prays and a man is allowed to have relation with her. So here the hadith says, فَاغْسِلِ عَنْكِ الدَّمْ ثُمَّ صَلِّي. So then take a bath and pray. In one narration, he said, فَإِذَا كَانَ الْآخِرُ فَتَوَضَّئِي وَصَلِّي. And when it is the false bleeding, then what? Make wudu for every prayer and pray, because this does not prevent the prayer. So we're talking here in this chapter about the menstrual bleeding. And we mentioned this before in the chapter previously about that which breaks one's wudu. That chapter we took before. We mentioned that which breaks one's wudu from it is istihada, dam istihada, the false bleeding for the woman. Like when she has a sickness or some cut or something down there, she may bleed, but it's not her menstrual bleeding because it has different characteristics. But nonetheless, she has to make wudu because it breaks her wudu when she bleeds in this fashion from her private area. So as opposed to that, we said dam hayd, the menstrual bleeding. Here, there's no question of wudu. She can't pray anyways. When it's the menstrual period, the 6 days or 7 days of the month, she cannot pray or fast. And then when the period is done and the blood has stopped, the menstrual bleeding, then she takes a bath and now begins to pray. So that's the two different bloods which we are just reviewing in this chapter. And we took the first hadith, which just differentiated the istihada. We mentioned the characteristics which differentiate the two bloods. And when it comes to hayd, also, just as a general guideline, because sometimes there's confusion as to what is the menstrual blood. What do we consider? Sometimes a woman may have some discharge, which is like a sufra, like a kind of yellowish, or could be a discharge which is called kudra, kudra is like ghasil al-lahm. It's like the pinkish, you could say, when you wash the meat, a little pinkish comes, okay, but not bright, not dark blood. We said menstrual blood was what? Dark, thick, has a smell. Okay, even one drop, that's menstrual blood. So before, when a woman is pure, okay, she has not started any of this dark blood yet, she has some of this yellowish or pinkish. Does she consider it menses? No. لا لا عبرة للسفرة والقدرة قبل الحيض. No, before the hayd starts, she does not consider this discharge as anything. She continues to pray and fast. وهذا يحصل عند أغلب نساء الدنيا، فتبدأ صفرة أو قدرة وتبقى طاهرا، ثم بمجرد نزول الدم ولو قطرة هي تعده حيضا عند أول قطرة الدم تبدأ الحيض. يبدأ الحيض ثم قد ينزل ضعيفا يوما أو يومين، ثم قد ينقطع تماما يوم أو يومين، ثم يعود بغزارة وشدة. وهذا الوقت كله من نزول أول القطرة وحتى الجفاف، كل هذا الوقت يعتبر ويعد حيضا. So what happens that a woman, we said, once she has the first drop of the blood, dark and so on, then her period starts. Then the bleeding may disappear for 1 or 2 days. Okay, and then it may come back. And when it comes back, or it will come back, when it comes back, it may be very, a lot and flowing blood. Okay, so or maybe light and different varieties of flowing. But all this whole period, she considers her menses. That's the point, because she had a definite beginning, which was the first drop of blood, which was the characteristic of menses. Even if it cut off between that and the flowing period, she considers that whole time her menses. Okay, all right, and then so she should not become confused if the bleeding stops all of a sudden. It can happen. It can stop all of a sudden and then it comes back in the next couple of days. That's all considered her menses, that whole time period, including the absence of blood. So when does she know when the menses is done? علامة الطهر أنها ترى جفافا نهائيا، أو أنها ترى القصة البيضاء، وهي ماء أبيض يدفعه الرحم عند انقطاع الحيض. So how does she know when the period is done? By the attribute of the blood, when the bleeding totally stops. Okay? Totally stops. It's been, and her time period is, elapsed, if she has a regular time period. Blood is totally stopped, or in some women, they get a clear discharge. Okay? A clear discharge, which is indication that her menstrual period is done. And the proof for this, لما جاء عند البخاري معلقا كنا نساء يبعثن إلى عائشة بالدرجة فيها الكرسف فيه الصفرة فتقول لا تعجلن حتى ترين القصة البيضاء. So a woman may have, in the end, we said, how do we know the period is totally done? Dryness, complete dryness, or that white or clear discharge. She may have yellow and may have pink before that. She does not consider that yellow or pink to be purity, that she's pure. No, considers that as her period. Okay? Why? Because هذا القاعدة أنها تستصحب الحال, that she continues upon the condition she had been in. This is a principle in the legislation, and this is a proof for it, that if she was upon menses, okay, and then she has something which is not clearly blood, yellowish, pinkish, towards the end of it, but she was on menses before, she considers that condition to be continued until she has a clear proof that it has ended. Okay? So we said this principle before, أنه ما ثبت بيقين فلا ينقل عنه إلا بيقين. Whatever a person is sure of, she's menses, right? She had the blood. We cannot move from that state until we have another clear proof. Okay? So she may have some pinkish, may have yellow, but it's all considered period until she has the clear proof, which is of the purity, which was what? Complete dryness, or a whitish or clear discharge. قصة البيضاء. This was the hadith of Aisha, or the narration, that the women, they used to bring to her for clarification some cotton which had yellowish discharge at the end of their period. She told them, do not be hasty until you see the clear discharge. This yellow and this stuff you see, don't be hasty. Continue your menses. Don't leave. What you're sure you're started, you can't leave that and go to another condition until you have proof. And so the same is true. If she becomes pure, she sees the white, the clear, or she has complete dryness, okay, she's pure now, right? What if in the couple of days later she sees some redness, some pink, some yellow? تستصحب الحال. هي تستصحب حال الطهر. هنا حالتها الطهر، فهي تستمر عليها حتى يثبت الحيض بيقين. فهي لا تنقل عن اليقين إلا بيقين. Similarly, she's for sure she saw the purity. Then she sees something confusing. See some yellow, some pink. Does she consider that anything? No, because it's not a clear sign that the next menstruation has come, right? So she continues on the purity, which was established certainly, which she had the clear sign of purity. Then, if she sees something confusing, yellow or or reddish, or sorry, pinkish, she does not pay any attention to that because that is not a sign of menses. We said the sign of menses beginning only when she sees that blood, even a drop, which is dark and thick and so on. Okay, so that is some rules concerning some guidelines concerning the menstrual bleeding. And the proof also is أثر عطية, a narration from one of the Sahabiyat. قالت كنا لا نعد القدرة والصفرة بعد الطهر شيئا رواه البخاري وأبو داود. وهذا بعد الطهر هذا القيد عند أبي داود وصححه الشيخ الألباني. So there's a narration from Atiyya, one of the Sahabiyat. She said, we used to not pay any attention to the yellow and the pink after the purity. Okay? So we see that there's no paying attention to any yellowish or pink, either after a woman is pure or even at the end of the period. She continues to consider her period until she sees the purity. So the point is, she has to have certain transition from one or the other. Okay. Just as a final point, the Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah قال إلا امرأة لا يأتيها جفاف نهائيا، أو لا يأتيها جفاف نهائي ولا يأتيها الخصة البيضاء، بل تلازمها القدرة والصفرة من حيضة إلى حيضة، فهذه علامة طهرها أن يتوقف الدم ولو بقيت الصفرة. And this is, we said, a woman, usually she's going to have some period of the total dryness. Okay? Most women have that clear end of their period. But there may be a case a woman always has some discharge, some yellow all through the month. Okay? Then in her case, she has to see when the bleeding stops. Okay? Her period is not done. And even if she still has some yellowish or pinkish, that's pure for her. Okay? That's the exception to the rule. And the woman, as we said, may have a change in her period. Although she's usually, all her life, she's been 6 days, 7 days, she may 1 month become 8 days, okay? Or 9 days, okay? So how would she know that this 8th and 9th day is still her period? How would she know? She examines the nature of the blood, okay? If she can distinguish, then she looks at the characteristics, صفات الدم الطبيعي، فإنها تستصحب الحال أي حال الحيض حتى يثبت غيره، لأن عادة النساء قد تتغير فتزيد أو ينقص أو تنتقل. Why? Because the woman's period can change. It may increase 1 month or the other. So as long as it has those, she's usually 6 days, but on the seventh day she still has the dark blood with the thickness and the smell. So she says the seventh day, my period is now extended, 7 or 8 days, and so on. And so that's not unusual. It can happen. So any questions to this point on the characteristics of the blood and the basic differentiation between dam hayd with dam istihada?
So for the menses, the characteristics are dark, thick, and has an odor.
Yes. And finally, there's another one some scholars say, which is it does not clot quickly. It's slow to clot, as opposed to the false bleeding of the vein or the vessel that clots quickly, similar to a cut we have on our arm. So you can think of the false bleeding like a person has a cut on his body. It's red, it's thin, there's no smell, and it clots quickly. That's the false bleeding. And a woman continues to pray and fast with that false bleeding. Okay? Any other question? So this is and there's another. We'll come to that inshallah in the following hadith. نأتي الآن إلى الحديث التالي، حديث الثالث والثلاثون بعد المئة، هو حديث أسماء بنت أميس عند أبي داود. وهي هذا الحديث أيضا في قضية فاطمة بنت أبي حبيش، يعني رواية أخرى. ولتجلس في مركا فإذا رأت سفرة فوق الماء فلتغتسل للظهر والعصر غسلا واحدا، وتغتسل للمغرب والعشاء غسلا واحدا، وتغتسل للفجر غسلا واحدا، وتتوضأ فيما بين ذلك. So the next hadith is continuing on the matter of the mustahada, the woman who has the false bleeding. Because now she's in a difficulty because she's having persistent bleeding and she has to pray. And she has to pray. It's not the menses. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, a way for her to distinguish between the blood, he had told her to sit in a container, okay, and see the nature of the blood, and said, once you see the false bleeding, okay, then take a bath. Means the menses is done. The dark blood has gone, the menses is done, okay. فلتغتسل, okay, للظهر والعشاء للظهر والعصر. And on top of that, he said, recommended for her to take 3 baths a day during her istihada, okay? Although she's pure, right? But she has to clean off the blood. Although it is not menstrual blood, she still has to clean it off from her when she prays. So she's recommended to take three baths. First bath at when she delays the dhuhr time, okay, and prays dhuhr and asr, at the border between the 2 times, or delays the dhuhr to the asr time, and she takes a bath and she prays both prayers, jama'an, dhuhr and asr. Same thing with maghrib. Maghrib she delays, okay, and she prays isha early, at the early time, and so she takes a bath and prays maghrib and isha. That's the second bath. And then the third bath for Fajr, because Fajr we don't combine. Woman does not combine, traveler does not ever combine. Fajr with another prayer. But these other sister prayers, Dhuhr and Asr, can be combined for the traveler as well, and Maghrib and Isha can be combined. So also for the mustahada, this is the recommended case. And the reason some scholars say that the bath is there is because it is a sickness. And sometimes taking the bath, the legislated bath, may be a cause to hasten the cure, to bring a cure from this sickness of this false bleeding. Okay? And so that's one of the wisdoms the scholars say. But otherwise, it's something, it's a worship, and she's rewarded. And this is the best way, if she can. But not all women can take 3 baths a day. That's why it's not obligatory upon them. And that's indicated in the next hadith. Hadith Hamna عن حمنا بنت جحش رضي الله عنها قالت كنت أستحاض حيضة كثيرة شديدة فأتيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أستفتيه فقال إنما هي ركضة من الشيطان فتحيضي 6 أيام أو 7 أيام ثم اغتسلي فإذا استنقعت فصلي 24 أو 23 وصومي وصلي فإن ذلك يجزئك وكذلك فافعلي كما تحيض النساء فإن قويت على أن تؤخري الظهر وتؤجلي العصر ثم تغتسلي حين تدخلين وتصلين الظهر والعصر جميعا ثم تؤخرين المغرب وتؤجلين العشاء ثم تغتسلين وتجمعين بين الصلاتين فافعلي وتغتسلين مع الصبح وتصلين قال وهو أعجب الأمرين إلي وهذا الحديث صححه أو حسنه البخاري وصححه الألباني رحمة الله على الجميع. So this hadith is about concerning another of the women of the Sahaba who had istihada. It something that was occurred in many women, and it occurs now in many women, as we know, a false bleeding. Some scholars say there was 9 of the Sahabiyat who had this false bleeding occur with them. So this is another one who's Hamna bint Jahsh. She is the sister of Zainab bint Jahsh, radiallahu anha, and she said, I used to have the false bleeding a lot, and a lot of blood would come. And I asked the Prophet ﷺ concerning the ruling. So he said to her, it is only a kick from the shaitan, meaning it is a physical effect that the shaitan is having upon you. So a person like the shaitan can cause waswasa, and it can cause a physical ailment as well. So this is a case where it caused this sickness. So he told her, فَتَحِيدِي 6 أيام أو 7 أيام. He said, so تحيدي 6 أيام أو 7. So make your menses, consider it 6 or 7 days. Why did he say 6 or 7 days? Because she did not have a regular period. We said usually a woman has a regular period, and then she becomes sick, and then she considers her regular period, or by the characteristics of the blood. But in her case, she had neither. She could not distinguish the nature of the blood, nor did she have a regular period before the sickness. So he told her to consider the period of her female relatives. Okay, and he said this concerning your female, like your mother, your sisters, your aunts, your maternal aunts. They have a certain period that is common between them usually, as in the bloodlines. So you consider according to them. If they usually have 7 days, you consider yourself 7 days. If they have 6 days, you consider yourself 6 days. And any such nature. So you consider that period like your female relatives, and then when that time is done, then you take a bath. Okay, because your period is done now. Okay, and then you start to pray for the rest of the month, 23 days or 24 days, depending on what number you had of the period. You pray, you fast, meaning you make wudu for every prayer. Okay, of the 5 prayers a day. Uh, but he said, what is better for you, if you can, if you're strong enough, is that you do the 3 baths, which was mentioned in the previous hadith for Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh. He told her, delay the dhuhr to close to Asr, and pray those together after a bath, and Maghrib and Isha with a bath, and Fajr with a bath. 3 baths, and combining the prayers. وهو أعجب الأمرين إلي. He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, this is the better way. So it's recommended. A woman is in this condition, this is recommended for her to do. But if it is difficult for her, she doesn't have to. Okay? She can choose the other option, which is simply to make a wudu for every of the 5 prayers. And when does she make that wudu? In the دخول الوقت. كما في اللفظ توضئي لكل صلاة أي لوقت كل صلاة. Then the other option, make a wudu at the beginning of the time period for every prayer. Okay? And pray that prayer individually. Even if that is difficult, maybe that become difficult for her too, to make a wudu for every prayer, because she does not only have to make wudu, she has to wash off her area, if she's consistently bleeding. So even then she can make a wudu and combine. Okay? So there's 3 levels of ways to do it. She can make a bath with 3 times and combine prayers as such. She can make wudu 5 times individually for every prayer, or she can make wudu 3 times with combination of Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, and Fajr. Okay? These are the 3 levels of difficulty that she can do, depending on what is, she can do without difficulty. Okay? لأن القاعدة أن المشقة تجلب التيسير, because the principle that difficulty brings ease. Okay? ولا حرج ما جعل الله عليكم في الدين من حرج. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He did not make any difficulty in the religion. All right? And this is the principle by which we say the person who has incontinence of urine, he's constantly breaking his wudu because he has dripping of the urine out of his control. Then he can similarly make a wudu, okay, at when the prayer comes in. And if it's difficult, he can combine the prayers in this fashion. If he cannot do it, clean himself 5 times a day, he can combine Dhuhr and Asr for 1 cleaning, Maghrib and Isha for a 2nd, and Fajr for a 3rd, in the similar fashion. And because, as we said, a woman would have to, not only make wudu, but also to clean herself and replace her pad and so on. For every time that she makes the wudu. Meaning if she's continuously bleeding. If she's not bleeding, obviously she doesn't have to. Her wudu maintains. If the bleeding stops, for example, for Dhuhr, Asr, or for Dhuhr, she cleans herself, she makes wudu, she changes her pad, and for some reason the bleeding stopped. For that time period, false bleeding, and she didn't pass wind or break her wudu for some other reason, then come Asr time, she can pray on that same cleansing and the same wudu, just like any other person. Okay, so that's so the bath in this case 3 times a day is recommended if she can do so. Otherwise, she makes wudu, as in the hadith of Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, فتوضئي لكل صلاة, in the Bukhari. Okay, any questions on that for the mustahada, the false bleeding, how she would proceed in her prayer? Okay, inshallah, I think we'll stop there. We can mention one more hadith. It's related to this, what is preceded. حديث الخامس والثلاثون بعد المئة عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن حبيبة بنت جحش شكت إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الدم فقال امكثي قدر ما كانت تحبسك حيضتك ثم اغتسلي فكانت تغتسل لكل صلاة. حبيبة بنت جحش. There's another narration that Habiba radiallahu anha, she inquired about her bleeding. So she asked the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So he told her, remain, meaning not praying or fasting, according to the number of days of your period. Similar to the hadith of Fatima, that according to your usual period, those number of days continue as usual. And then take a bath because the period is ended. Okay? Although you're still bleeding, the false bleeding, you still take a bath. And then on her own, she used to take a bath for every prayer. Okay? We said taking a bath for every prayer, to while it's in istihala, is not recommended. The recommendation is combining 3 baths, okay, and combining the prayers. But she did this on her own, from her own desire, to do from her own, to take a bath 5 times. And this is the explanation from the scholars, that she did this from her own inclination, but is not something that a woman has to do in this condition, based upon the other hadith we mentioned. Next hadith, we mentioned this as well. The author mentioned in this book, حديث السادس والستون أو السادس والثلاثون بعد المئة عن عطية رضي الله عنها قالت كنا لا نعد القدرة والصفرة بعد الطهر شيئا. That when it comes to the yellowish or the pinkish discharge that a woman may have after she becomes pure, in that pure period she may have that discharge. This is Atiyah narration. She said we used to not consider that anything, meaning we would continue upon the condition we were upon of purity, and we didn't pay any attention to that yellowish or the pinkish until, of course, the bleeding, the next period started with the bright red blood, with the bright red bleeding, or I'm sorry, the dark black bleeding of menses. طيب إن شاء الله سنكتفي بهذا القدر. والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم. Any questions on this topic? Otherwise, the rest of the chapter is on some different aspects and issues related to the menses. We'll take that next week. إن كان في الأمور بقية. اللهم اغفر لنا ولوالدينا وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات. اللهم وفقنا لكل ما تحب وترضى. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا أجمعين.
Yeah. Mine is sort of not a question, but maybe like a recommendation, because these lessons are very important, most especially like in our community. I'm just wondering, maybe I would have to put that to the board, the masjid. If like